I grew up in a Christian family. Parents were both Christians, and I suppose my testimony is that I don't have a moment where I became a Christian, so to speak. I think I just always was. I grew up and I didn't stray in any kind of obvious way. So just imbibed it naturally through the home, through church, and through discussing things around the dinner table and so on. I think there are certain points in my life where faith became a bit more tangible or a bit more real or a bit more explicit, I suppose, because we didn't go to evangelical churches growing up. They were more kind of quite high church, parents into quite high Anglican stuff. So I think some of it was a little bit over my head, some of that church tradition and the bells and the smells and that kind of thing. I have more of an appreciation for it now, understanding the context of that. But I think going on Christian camps, sports camps and things like that, and then going to university, it really helped me to root my faith and understand what is being a Christian. I know there's a God, I know that he loves me, I've always sensed that, but actually what is the gospel? What does it mean to be saved, by grace, and to live that out? Seeing, really having Christian friends for the first time at university, I think was a big transition point for me to understand what does that mean to live it out. So here I am now. I guess that's my journey in a nutshell.
Thanks, Toby.
So I'm probably more the black sheep. I had a very good sense of God, the reality of good and evil from being a young boy. And I would hear from God, and I would feel things, and I would say things sometimes that would be quite empowering. I remember saying something to my dad, and he was quite blown away how I'd received that as a child. But then I kind of went, as often happens, I kind of lost interest in it in teenage years. I didn't have any Christian friends. When I tried to bring it up, they thought, man, you are gullible, what is going on? So I didn't. So I kind of repressed it, but I was still an altar boy in my spare time kind of thing. I still kept my foot in the door with it. But I hit a crisis where I had some kind of physical injury when I was working as a waiter in my gap year between study and university, where I dropped all the plates. My hands swelled up and nobody could tell me what was going on with this. And I went into a really dark place. I defer university entrance. And I didn't know what to do, but I remember seeing The Miracle Maker that our dad had wrote the screenplay for. And one afternoon I just said, look, I'm throwing it all in with you, Jesus, because I've got nothing left. And I honestly didn't want to live because the pain was excruciating. And then I had a vision of myself in a cellar, kind of tied up, chained to the wall. And sometime after that, then I saw these chains were freed. And this door opened and God's light came into this really dark place. And I could see this as a vision. And the pain started to subside in my hands. And from that moment, I knew God once again, like I did as a young boy, and it changed my whole life. So, and I then made friends with Christians. I went to university. I had this energy, I had this vitality, I had this excitement about filmmaking because God had given me this love of doing that. And I saw a lot of people get saved, and it was incredible. But it was a real up and down journey to get to that point. So that was it for me.
Thank you. Thanks for sharing that. I love that everyone's story is different. No matter how many times you hear people's stories, they're all different. So thank you for that. So I've got some questions here to ask you before we open it up to the room. So I'm going to pick on Toby. Could you make the case to someone in this room who's a skeptic who thinks Christians simply should not be making horror films? You probably come across those sort of people like, that's wrong, you shouldn't be doing this.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think that when I first started focusing on horror and kind of, I guess, identifying more as a sort of Christian horror filmmaker, I expected a lot more pushback from people, particularly Christian community, of people who might say, oh, but the Bible says you should focus on noble things and nice things and all of that, whatever is true, whatever is lovely and all of this, think about these things. But actually I've had an amazing experience with Christians being very open and interested in what I'm doing, and I think everyone understands the Bible is full of lots of horror. God is not afraid of horror. Right at the heart of the Christian story, there's obviously the cross, a very gruesome and horrific event, and God's not ashamed to kind of put that front and center and say this is something we're going to remember constantly, every moment of our lives, and celebrate for us. And as I say, the Bible is full of stories of encounters with horror, demon possession, and evil in mankind, in the world. So I guess the question is, you know, which of us is able to communicate about that, to talk about that, and to go to those places and research those things and live and breathe in that world and not be affected by that. I would always say that, you know, horror is a bit like going out for a curry. You know, a British tradition here that it's when some people, you go out for a curry in the UK, some people like a lovely tame chicken korma, no spice. That's a good night for them. And other people love the kind of the vindaloo, the madras, the really spicy stuff. And the two would never order the other person's meal because that would be a disaster of an evening. And I think that in some ways horror is a bit like that. For some people, our dad in particular doesn't like horror movies. I think he, you know, wrestled initially with the idea of us making those kinds of films. Some people are very sensitive to that, and I would never say to them, you know, you must watch these kinds of films, you must engage with this, because actually for them, they probably should focus a bit more on the lovely things, and that's right for their temperament. But I do think some of us, clearly the horror audience is huge in the world. Some for not a good reason, but some good reason too. There are a lot of people who are very interested in understanding and coming to God and to spirituality through the kind of the back door, if you like, the dark side. That's what they find interesting, what appeals to their imagination. And I think having communicators who understand what is true horror, who is the devil, what does he want, who is God, what does good look like, people who really understand that, and being able to communicate that, it's really key, I think, that Christians are out there doing that, so that the world, as well as all the kind of secular horror movies and people who don't necessarily know how to handle that material, Christians are flooding the marketplace with stuff that says, yeah, this is real, this is horrific and frightening, but have you thought about these things? You know, see it like this. What if the story is redemptive in this way? So I guess that's my case for Christian horror.
Fionn, is there anything you want to add or push back on?
No, I think that, I mean, we should have Christians represented in kind of all sectors, really, you know, whether it's politics or sport. And filmmaking is just another one of those things where we need those voices, we need those stories. And in fact, maybe Christians are best placed to, for example, understand the supernatural horror movie. And I think it's pretty much what Toby said, but I think it's a shame if there's a kind of blanket Christians don't go into that place, because actually, you know, any place can be redeemed. There's nowhere where God can't go and redeem. And I think we've felt somewhat a calling to do this. And we've questioned it at times, and, you know, sometimes you need a break from it because you end up doing a lot of quite dark research sometimes. And that's fine. And we don't love all horror movies. I think it's a very broad genre. There's sub-genres within horror. We're interested in the supernatural, not probably so much the kind of revenge or zombies or really heavy kind of gory stuff, but more the kind of unexplained, paranormal, what's going on. That's probably more of our home, as you can see with the trailers. So it's a complex genre, and that needs unpacking for one thing. But most people seem to be interested in the fact we're doing that, and they don't judge us. I've had one person say, "Oh, horror movies glorifying Satan, wow," but that came through our mother. But I think that person was a little bit maybe off the rails. So I don't take it too seriously, but that's fine. And it's like Toby said, it's not for everybody, and I don't think everybody should watch them.
I think a lot of, you know, what gets made is partly driven just by commercial forces. You know, if there's an audience for it, then the studios, you know, who have the most prolific output, as well as the independents like us, will pursue those stories. I think but then if you look at why is there an appetite for films in that genre, you know, why do people enjoy being scared? That's a big philosophical question. Yeah, I think there's a real place for horror movies in our increasingly secular age, where it seems, well, I think we have been a more secular age, the era of new atheism, let's say, you know, kind of the shedding of the old traditional Christianity, nominal Christianity. Why is there such an interest? There's always an interest in horror, and if anything, there's more of an interest now. And I think along with that, there's quite a big interest in the occult, and you see that much more on social media, things like TikTok, Witch Talk. I think that's fascinating to study as a horror filmmaker. Why is it interesting? Because people have a God-shaped hole in their lives. They're looking for something. They're looking for something outside themselves, something, I like to call it, the numinous, that sense of the other, something that's on the one hand terrifying and almost repulsive because it's so different, but also beautiful and attractive, much like the cross, that these things are melded together. People are seeking that, and they're not necessarily looking for it in kind of faith-based movies or kind of Bible Belt media stuff. Some people only understand the language of horror or thriller or sci-fi and so on. So in a sense, I think it's no accident that there's such popularity and a drive to make these films, because there is a hunger in people, particularly in an age where people are interested in the supernatural.
I think that, mainstream horror is just driven by market forces. I think these subgenres tend to kind of go in cycles. So if people are watching found footage movies like Blair Witch, when that came out, the studios will start trying to make that kind of stuff. It's very much driven by that and the commercial aspect. I think in an independent film, like we're working in, it might be more of a case of, well, this is an important story to tell and we're breaking in our own model, but we're not working necessarily within those same market forces. So I don't think that there's an overall agenda to keep God in the picture at all. If they had it their way, they'd probably keep God completely out of the picture. But people still want to watch those movies. Yeah, and they do. And when a film like The Exorcist came out originally, people flooded the church. People, for the maybe first time, thinking, "Oh my goodness, maybe I need to sort myself out spiritually," and it did have a kind of effect. And obviously, that's a film that clearly shows this kind of spiritual warfare. I mean, other movies probably like The Shining probably wouldn't do that, but these are some of the big movies. But God will use different films, to talk to people, because cinema is a language, and it's a language that will speak sometimes into people's hearts. Yeah. I know Toby was on a Scripture Union kids camp, and a boy, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but a boy stood up one night and said, at one point he was thinking about killing himself, but he watched The Dark Knight Rises, and God spoke to him in that film, and he decided not to. And when you think of the music of Hans Zimmer, for example, it's so spiritual, it's so beautiful. And those films touch on a lot of darkness as well. So it's not like, well, here's the horror movies and here's the other movies. Like these things overlap. And, darkness comes into lots of different genres of film. But it's an interesting space to be in. It's a language that we want to learn, and we were open to what does God want us to do. And, of course, we're open to other genres as well,
It's important to remember that, we're told in the Bible that the devil masquerades as an angel of light, so if you really want to see true horror, look at the rom-coms, because, what kind of lies and trash are we being sold through those kinds of movies? The daytime TV, peddling kind of very materialistic or unhelpful worldviews, lifestyles and expectations and so on. With horror, where you've got very obvious black and white kind of good and evil, in some sense that it's not much of a threat, really. If you don't like being scared, then don't watch it. But in some sense, you kind of know where you are with horror. There's a good person, and they've done something wrong, or they've opened the door to evil. Evil comes in, and then the rest of the film is that person trying to undo it or find a way to undo it. And at the end, they either defeat the evil some way, or they don't. But either way, there's a moral universe in that you understand there is such a thing as evil. And good has to fight against it somehow, and there's always a parallel to the gospel of what is the salvation in the universe of that film. But I think it's a lot more murky in the rom-coms and the comedies and the dramas and so on, because everything's so wonderfully attractive and beautiful, and it's not always clear what the worldview is or who's good and who's evil, which is in some senses much more like real life, because things aren't as black and white in real life as much as we like them to be.
I think there's a kind of, certainly when it comes to things like the occult, there's a kind of respect for the set and the subject matter. When we've made films, we have had people pray over the film and support us in what the actors are going to have to go to some dark places. And the welfare of people is very important. And we would, we're very much against any of that kind of exploitation of of certain techniques that have been used in film before to get those kind of results and things. So I think there's awareness of that, but also of not glorifying any of that, which like Toby said, horror movies tend not to do that anyway. That if somebody plays with darkness, it tends to come back badly on them. So I think it's kind of going in fully awake to what you're doing. And for example, we're going to be filming in an old derelict building soon. And when me and Toby have been scouting out this building, it does feel like there's something in there and it feels unresolved and the place does need blessing. And what I found is if you don't concentrate on it, it doesn't have much power. But if you concentrate on it, it feeds off that and it gets worse. So when I go in that building, I just think of the great space it's going to be, the beautiful place of creativity and all the rest of it. And we will have it blessed by somebody to clear whatever it is out. But I think if you were coming in naive, maybe without that Christian understanding, you'd probably be ghost hunting in that building and attracting all sorts of heaviness onto it. And I think you see that happen a lot on social media. So I think when you believe this stuff is real, there's a different approach, both to writing and how you go about the filmmaking.
With Playhouse and Black Dreamer, without trying to give any spoilers if anyone wants to watch them, different endings. Black Dreamer is perhaps more of an entertaining ending with a lack of redemption, actually, because it's making a statement about what's going on in the protagonist's life and the final act that he commits. And I guess that, on the one hand, if you watch the film, it's quite black humoured. There's quite a bit of comedy and stuff in there as well, as the horror. So it's supposed to be quite sort of an unsettling but amusing ending. But the idea with having an unresolved and unredemptive ending, I think in some horror films can be more powerful than a nice clean-cut ending where, good wins out. Because I think it leaves you as the audience thinking, oh gosh, I'm glad I don't live in that world where there's no redemption. And I've come away from some films that have felt very bleak and nihilistic, but I've also thought, I think the filmmaker's intention is to make me unsettled and think, I'm glad I don't live in that space where there's no force of good. There's nothing coming to rescue you. And I can walk away from the cinema as a Christian at least thinking, wow, I'm glad that there is a God, there is Jesus who's saved me, and so I don't have to worry about these things. So I guess we're open to both kinds of endings. I think with a horror film, you're always kind of teasing for a sequel as well. So I think it's always quite nice, if you can there's a sense of redemption that, characters can have good outcomes, evil's defeated, but it just lingers just a little bit. There's just an indication of it's just there, which I think is closer to reality, that just when you think you've overcome one trial and evil's gone, we know in this side of heaven, actually, it's going to come back. It's not gone fully. And you have to live daily in that reality. So yeah, I feel that's how we might approach it.
It's both. Yeah, I think very much that tech, it democratized the film business so that we could all get video cameras and editing software and we could make the films, which was great because in the past it was so difficult to make them. But it also oversaturated the market. So, and the streamers eventually got less and less money. So, it's very hard to see any return for these small movies. At the same time, the world of social media and Patreon and YouTube and all these things can be really helpful for building a community around what you're doing. So the film can be almost like a marketing tool that attracts people to then support what you're doing, and the fandom is great and people buy the merchandise and all the rest of it. So technology both helps and hinders. It's really not black and white on that issue. I think when you make films, though, you often really want the cinema experience. That's the dream, is to get it in the cinemas. We did manage that with Playhouse in Russia, Mexico, and Colombia. Some very lethal countries in some ways. But you that's what you want to happen. But the attention span isn't always there now for cinema screening. So there's this pressure to, get it, if it's going to go on Prime or whatever, it needs to be very quick, it needs to get on with it. And that can be a frustration because maybe you want a slow burn 80s horror intro with, big credits and orchestral music, but actually a lot of people are going to turn off from it. So there's that kind of pressure between the art and the film you want to make, and then also commerce and what distributors are saying is, well, you do need to kind of over-explain this film. But what's great about what we're doing is we're kind of free from some of those pressures in a way. It's like we're in this very fortunate place where we are making the films we want to make, and we're certainly not earning a lot of money from it or whatever, and working with tiny budgets, but that's great fun to be in that place, and it's like being kids with the camera and the dressing up box, and I'm very happy to do that, and I wouldn't want to be under necessarily the level of pressure. I mean, we know a friend of ours, for example, he edited one of the Star Wars movies, and he pretty much had a nervous breakdown doing it, and after that wanted to just do indie movies, because they can beast you, in Hollywood and all the rest of it. So at the same time, if we get a larger budget for something, that would be great. That'd be fun. We're open to that. But right now we're actually going to do a feature film for less than £5,000. And that's just a completely ridiculous thing to try and do, but that's what we're going to try and do.
Yeah, it's weird because often people expect that in your career you go up the budgets. You make one for 65, and I think for a while we thought, we go up, double, triple that, more. Yeah, exactly. And we've got filmmaking peers who've done a film of 65k around that budget, and then they're like, right, it's 5 million or nothing now. Yeah. But the truth is, the industry doesn't actually reward you to that degree, unless your film's been an absolute breakout hit, and everyone wants it. The next thing from you. Most of the time it's like, well, actually no, just you've got to make something else. So we've actually been working down the budgets. So Black Daruma was only about 40,000, and we shot that in 8 days. And this next one, 5,000 or so. Partly because it's like it takes so long to try and package a film and get it written and financed and so on to a much higher level. It's like, well, in the meantime, I need to be making something. I need to actually be practicing the craft and showing what am I doing. Otherwise, we've got friends who they only have £1 million scripts and so on sat around, and they're not getting anywhere, and they're endlessly having meetings and going to film markets and networking, and you just think, you've gone 5 or 6 years and you haven't made anything. And that's fine if you're really focused on that, but for us, we're like, we went in this to make films, so no matter how humble it is. And I think actually because of tech, it means you can make a film for 5,000. It will have probably a niche audience, but those fans will really enjoy it. You can actually connect directly with them, straight on YouTube or through your mailing list or whatever it is. And that's very rewarding, and ultimately that's why we went into it. And we think that's a better business model, to churn out more films for less than to sit around, hoping that we'll get a lottery ticket of, huge investment.
You learn to be very resourceful. So Playhouse, we spent £65,000, but actually that film looks like it's had hundreds of thousands spent on it. But one thing, our dad happens to own the building, the castle, and you'd pay a lot of money. You'd pay a lot of money to rent that. We got that for free. So the budget's always misleading, as well, really, in terms of what people spend on these films. But there is something fun about not having a large crew, going into a building with some actors and playing and having fun. And you know what? And with the Red Room, something doesn't work. Okay, so what? We'll just go back the next day and film it again. It's different when we did a co-production last year where we did have about £250,000 to make this film, and it was so pressured and we had 3 weeks to do it. But we needed $1 million to make sense of that, because we had animals and we had stunts, and me and Toby were wrung out by the end of it. It was very complicated movie to do, and actually there's a reason why certain scale of film does need a lot of money thrown on it. But if you're doing a found footage film like we're working on with the Red Daruma and stuff, you don't need a lot of money for that, because it's the subgenre lends itself to that. A bit like a film like Paranormal Activity or Blair Witch. And if a film like that did break out and did go into cinemas, the profits would be ridiculous, like absolutely huge. So there's always the possibility for that, but at the same time, none of us are doing it for that reason, because if we really want to be making a lot of money, we'd probably be working in, I don't know, investment banking or tech or something,
I think we find if they're a good actor, they're amazing at entering the space of the character you've created on the page. And clearly, in that film, the character on the page is dancing with dark subject matter. He's a writer who's moved to a castle to make a play based on historic legends of bad things that have happened there, and his daughter finds out and she gets upset and so on. And so he was able to say, okay, if I am this character, what would I be thinking? And it's funny that he said that in the interview, because without going into it, he did go to some dark places from his past that we weren't aware of, and did cause us some issues on the set, because it was really interfering with how he was off camera. He's a lovely guy, but quite difficult in many ways. It brought things up for him from his past. that he was into. So we actually did learn from that, actually. If we're going to direct actors and there's any sense of they might have some past involvement with anything dark that they might be drawing on or something, then just to have that conversation with them and say, look, we want you to enjoy the experience and for this to be a safe experience for you. It's just acting, it's a job. And so just let us know if there's a risk here of this being difficult. Same way if you were making a film about something else traumatic that was relevant.
Do the actors know that you're not afraid of any of this stuff? You've got a say of it.
I think during the shoot with Playhouse, the sound recordist picked up. He said, "I feel there's something helping us to do this. I can feel something pushing us along and protecting us." And then we opened up discussions about faith. And we said, we're Christians, but we haven't necessarily been always explicit at that. We've never market ourselves as Christian filmmakers. We're filmmakers who are Christians, because you apply that label to other things doesn't make any sense. I mean, what's a Christian boxer? Somebody who doesn't punch anybody, or a Christian architect who builds bridges that don't fall down. You don't put those labels on other things. But of course, we are filmmakers and we are inspired by our faith. So our faith is naturally going to come out in the work. But yeah, you just have to kind of be aware of what you're doing and the territory you're going into, and be careful with, I guess, certain actors have sensibilities. And I think casting directors can be useful because they all know this. A certain actor has a problem with this. They're a great actor, but don't let them near a drink, kind of thing. And every shoot we've had has been actually quite traumatic and difficult so far. Every one of them has almost not happened, and you do wonder also the spiritual battle against that as well. We're two guys who are out there on a limb doing what God's called us to do, and the world does not want people out there like us doing this kind of thing, and you feel that. So that's why you pray and you get support around it. And there's, our dad's often spoke to us about this as well. Doing the Miracle Maker, he had lots of things kicking off around him at that time. So, so it all teaches you.
And the way you react to that in a professional setting speaks volumes about your faith and who you are as people, doesn't it?
Yeah, and I think so.
How
I
you
think
deal with the difficulty.
Yeah, film has a reputation outside of horror, for highly pressured situations, a lot of money on the line, a lot of stress, people being very abusive or inappropriate and so on, but so far we've always managed to maintain a calm, composure, and I think certain people have commented on that and reflected on our ability just to control ourselves, just to have self-control under the pressure, under the stress, not to take it out on people and so on. So that is key, actually, how you are with people is important.
It makes me think of, in the behind the scenes on Playhouse, I think it's you, Fionn, said you woke up in the night terrified because you saw a coat hanging up.
I think I was...
it sometimes gets
It does wire itself into your nervous system. I think you get, on that Playhouse as well, we're very sleep deprived by the end. You work to do a feature film in 13 days like that. You had so little sleep, and I think that kind of thing can play on your mind just for a second, and then you sort of shake it off. But yeah, it's the real you're kind of having this kind of fun world of horror, but every now and then it can seep into you. And I remember even with Black Daruma doing one of the scenes down in the basement when the character's going to pour lighter fluid on himself. And we're so up close to him, and you do start to absorb some of that, horror. And I think the other actor said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "I think I might just need to go in the garden just for a minute," because I'm very sensitive to environments. That's why I was saying about this building that we're planning to film in. I tend to pick things up from an environment or from people, both good and bad. Toby probably less so. Toby's like just kind of very well composed and straight down the line. But I can sometimes pick up these things and need maybe a little bit more of that spiritual protection, but at the same time also it can maybe give me insights into things that I will share with Toby, which can be helpful also with the writing process. So, yeah.
I'm glad you said horror film as well, because sometimes people say, have you got a favourite film? And it's like, you have to ask per genre, because for every genre there's a favourite, isn't there? I think we both agree that Candyman from the 80s, 1988 I think it was, that's our favourite horror film, hands down. Really, really great movie. I think it encapsulates the kind of the wonderful era of filmmaking was the 80s with its music and its sort of fantasy elements and wonderful score by Philip Glass. And the villain in that he's a bizarrely kind of romantic and attractive figure, and there's a tragic story around why he's become the villain. So in that sense, he's a very well-rounded and developed character, but also it's really frightening. It's a very effective film, but profound and deep as well. So it has a lot going for it. But not a film I would say to watch if you're new to horror or nervous about horror, because it's
just trying to watch that.
yeah. So
That's a good question. Yeah, I think certainly praying, having a good discipline around prayer and church life and commitment to that, to develop an awareness of when it's time to take a break. Mm-hmm. When you're reading a lot of things, you're taking a lot of darkness, and you don't get overly obsessed, and you say, okay, right, I'm going to the health club for a bit, I'm going to talk to people, I'm going to spend some time with my kids. Because it can start to get oppressive. And also certain movies, I think mainly when I've decided to watch films for research purposes that I might not normally watch, and you can just feel sometimes, you know what, is this film really helpful to me? I'm starting to feel like, something like being drained of spiritual energy, and actually I just stop that, I won't watch that. And I think that you developing that kind of awareness, but also we discuss things together, keep each other accountable, and that really helps as well as I think other people knowing what we're doing and asking our network to pray for us over certain projects.
What's your network that prays for you?
So our dad runs something called the Wayfarer Trust, which is like spiritual encouragement for people in the arts. So there's like quite a few people around that. So if we tell him to pray for us, he will probably tell people about that. Toby's got his own church, and I've got my own church here, and that community around that. And then certain friends from university, we've both probably got 2 or 3 really close friends that will be people of faith as well. We'll share sometimes that with them as well.
I think we might have got into horror kind of because of commercial reasons, actually. That it's one of the easiest genres to break into as a new filmmaker. There's a very large committed audience to it, but also it's a unique genre in that you don't need what you call named cast, famous talent, to be in the film, because it's very concept driven. It's just, a bunch of people get trapped in a cube, and then they end up killing each other or something, and everyone's like, oh great, sound, I'll watch that. And actually, you don't need Tom Cruise in that to get people to the cinema. So therefore, it's a great genre for low-budget filmmakers to get into. And I think we started to realise when we were developing ideas for our first film, because Playhouse originally was probably going to be like a drama or something, we were thinking along those lines. And they couldn't quite crack that and ended up settling on something that was more of a thriller sort of thing. But it was actually when it went to the market, and we'd made the film, we took it to sales agents who sell films to platforms and distributors. They were like, no, we'll package it up as a horror and we'll put it out and put a kind of scary cover on it and poster, and we'll sell that. And then we realised, actually, like a lot of films get funneled into that genre because there's such a committed fan base and of people who are quite forgiving as well towards low production value. So there are some quite pragmatic reasons why we get into horror. But I think the more we got into it for those reasons, the more we started to watch it and really appreciate the genre and start to realise, actually, in its own right, it's a really fascinating space, a great space for Christians to work in as well, because of the ability to play overtly with light and darkness as well, and explore what we think about supernatural and life after death and so on.
I think that like early exposure to certain films, I can remember being, it's pretty horrifying to think of, but I was 9 years old at a sleepover with my friends in Cardiff. My parents had no idea about this, but the older brother of my friend rented Candyman from the video store. And we watched that and we were freaked out as kids, but I remember being quite fascinated by why I was freaked out about that film and what that was, and those kind of almost those videos you shouldn't be looking at. But I think our mum recorded all the Twin Peaks series on VHS. And Twin Peaks, I don't know if many people remember that, but it was like a sort of spiritual, very bizarre, surreal soap opera. But there was a lot of spiritual levels to it, and the work of David Lynch became very interesting to me. And I think when I saw Mulholland Drive at about age 18, within moments of seeing that film, I felt God speaking to me saying, you're going to direct, that's what you're going to do. And I knew it was something to do with this kind of filmmaking. And David Lynch films are kind of like horror movies, but they're also like art house movies. You can't even put them into genre. Even The Elephant Man, The Elephant Man's an incredible film, but it is quite a horrifying film with how the Elephant Man was treated in Victorian London things. So I think all these early influences kind of went into us as kids, and we just naturally felt quite drawn to that. Although, weirdly, the films we've made aren't even strictly horror. I mean, Playhouse is more like a supernatural thriller. I think teenagers quite like it. It's quite tame, really. Depending on your tolerance level. I mean, maybe for some people in this room, it might be, well, that is a horror movie. But if you really like, the hardcore kind of horror, you might think, well, it's not really a horror movie. And Black Droomer has got a kind of a black comedy kind of vibe to it, and a sort of kitchen sink social commentary about imploding masculinity. So the thing is, I don't even know if we truly have made a horror movie yet, but hopefully maybe next time. But there's a mystery to what you do, because you think you're making this, but the film becomes its own thing. There's a kind of magic that happens. So and the genres are, they're not fixed.
And a lot of it is to do with how it gets packaged up at the end and put on the shelf. It's what label to the distributors, the supermarket.